Hey, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you are listening to, or indeed watching this episode 117 of Hypnosis Week. As always, it's me by birth, Alex William Smith, but better known to many of you as Jonathan Royal Hypnotist of hypnosisweek.com and magicalguru.co.uk. And boy, have I got a guest for you this week. Before I introduce you to him, and this guy, I've got some questions that are going to blow your mind, audience listeners, and so you want to stay tuned here. But they've got a new book out. And the reason I say they is that this gentleman who I'm about to introduce you to is called Patrick Fagan. And along with his co-author, Laura Dodsworth, who is a journalist and also has previously had a book out called, and I look at my notes here so that I don't misquote it, but it's called A State of Fear. And it's all about how COVID-19 was weaponized. Fear was used against the mass populace during the pandemic. This gentleman who I'm about to introduce you to, depending on which way this recording comes out, is on the left or right-hand side of me, also has a book out called Hooked, Why Cute Sells and Other Marketing Magic We Just Can't Resist. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well later on. But the book we're going to talk about most today is the one that they jointly released. Okay, you'll find it on Amazon and all major booksellers by searching Patrick Fagan or Laura Dodsworth, and of course the name of the book, which is Free Your Mind, subtitled The Must-Read Expert Guide on How to Identify Techniques to Influence You and How to Resist Them. I'm just going to read you, before I introduce you to Patrick and bring him onto the stage, so to speak, what it says on the Amazon listing, okay? The Amazon listing, which points out that this was an instant Sunday Times best-selling book, okay? Learn how to recognize and resist the daily attempts to control and manipulate your mind. There's a war on for your mind. You may not notice it, but you are surrounded by manipulators, advertisers, politicians, big tech, even the humble waiter who asks, still or sparkling water? Free Your Mind is your field manual to surviving the information battlefield. In this indispensable book, Laura Dodsworth and Patrick Fagan draw on interviews with mind control experts, ranging from monks to magicians, infiltrate cults and forums to uncover their most deceptive techniques and expose the hidden tactics used to influence you, from social media to subliminal messages. Learn how to recognize the nudges, dispel efforts to brainwash you, and always question those who say the choice is yours. If you don't control your mind, someone else will. Please welcome to Hypnosis Week, episode 117. One of the authors, the man himself, Mr. Patrick Fagan. How are you doing, Patrick?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for being here. One thing I want to point out straight away, people, when they go searching, they'll find out straight away that you, amongst, on your website, it mentions the fact that you were a former lead psychologist at Cambridge Analytica.
Yes.
And listeners of my podcast will know that in the past I've interviewed a fellow hypnotist and friend of mine, Neil Sanders, who has a website, Neil Sanders mindcontrol.co.uk, where on his blog and podcasts that are free, he did a massive, I'm going to say expose, but before it became in the public domain, as it is now through all the Netflix documentaries and whatnot, about Cambridge Analytica and how they appeared to have influenced, nudged people, brainwashed, hypnotized, call it what you will, people to vote a certain way in various political elections around the world, Brexit, Trump and whatnot. So I think the first thing, so we can get it out of the way before we go on to the book, that I should ask, otherwise listeners and viewers will be going, why aren't you asking him this, is, did you know what the actual main purpose of Cambridge Analytical was when you were working for them? Did you know it was a government military grade PSYOP weapon?
Well, I should specify that I was in the commercial team at Cambridge Analytica. So they had a political team and a commercial team. So I was helping to use targeted advertising for bottled water and investment apps. I didn't really have much influence or involvement in the political side of things at that company. Did I know? Well, so I was there for the last 7 months. And so I joined after the Trump campaign. So I knew these techniques were being used for politics. I'm fairly apolitical, so I wasn't really all that fussed about who they were using it for, to be honest. And I was, as a psychologist, like really, I suppose, impressed by the use of these techniques and kind of keen to learn more about it. I do think there is, and we talk about this in the book, but there's a big kind of illusion, and there's a lot of theatre, I think, around the name Cambridge Analytica and what they did and didn't do. So, which I'm very happy for people to believe, because they think I'm some kind of MK Ultra magician, which has not been bad for business. So they did some very cool things, sophisticated things, probably did influence elections, but I think to call it brainwashing and mind control at a mass level, it's probably taking it a bit far. It was essentially targeted advertising. There was another offshoot called SCL.
Isn't that just SQL, strategic communications, which is stuff that Neil Sanders goes into, and the evidence undeniably shows that they were influencing people to change their political viewpoints, where if they had not been targeted through all the data points and bits of information that had been, it appears, illegally harvested through things like Facebook platforms, because Facebook have recently had to settle a lawsuit and pay out people a share of a big pot of money for their data being shared. That without that information being used against people, weaponized, so to speak, that they probably wouldn't have changed their political opinions. Now, this is a two-part question. One, how much were you aware that was going on? Because some of this is semantical. I would argue it's all mind control, because any form of communication that's used to alter somebody's beliefs, feelings, emotions, thoughts, or reactions without their conscious knowledge that it's going on, I would argue is mind control. And obviously that's covered in many different facets in the book Free Your Mind. Whether you call it advertising, political influence, Cambridge Analytica, MK Ultra, all of them kind of are mind control, I would argue. Come back on me on that, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. So we say in the book, all forms of communication are a form of influence. To get a bit woo-woo about it, the word spell has a double meaning. So to spell is to put letters or symbols in an order to influence what's at the top of people's minds and therefore change their behavior and thus manifest reality. And that's what a spell in the magic sense is as well. It's the manipulation of symbols to change reality. And that's really what communication is. So even in this conversation, I'm saying certain words in a certain order in order to influence what you and your listeners are thinking. So yes, absolutely, it was a form of persuasion, brainwashing, mind control, if you want to be extreme, but everything is to a certain extent. And we could talk about the targeted advertising of Cambridge Analytica and beyond, which is effective, and there's academic research to support that, but there's also Hollywood, academia, the media. These are all, I would say, much bigger powerhouses of influence, especially.
I would certainly agree that the media, whether that be through films, as you say, and what I'm going to say, that people in the truth or conspiracy community, I'm using that term loosely, Law, but people who tend to draw attention to these things would say that in things like films, they refer to it as things like predictive programming.
Yeah.
What's your view on things like that?
So we have a chapter in the book on symbolism.
Okay, cool.
Predictive programming, maybe a step too far for me, perhaps, but I'm open to it. But I'm aware of the examples that people rays around it, and they are a bit spooky, let's say, but I think they can just be coincidences. But there's two things in the book we talk about which touch on this. One is the illusion of choice and the illusion of control, and that really influences. If someone's trying to change your mind, they need you to feel like it was your decision. They can't force you into it. You can't push a donkey from behind, as one of our interviewees said for the book. So you need to make people feel like it was their choice. And so there is this idea of what's it called, revelation of the method, so that people, they need to let you know what they're doing to you so that you accept it on some subconscious level. So, you know, there's no evidence for this, there's no scientific papers, it's all a bit kind of fuzzy. So I'm not endorsing that, but it is an interesting theory. And then the second thing, we have a chapter on symbolism, which is undoubtedly used in movies, music videos especially. I mean, you can't really watch music videos without seeing the one eye or the black and white checkered floors and Masonic floors, stuff like that. The question is, you know, is there some grand conspiracy, occult magic happening there, or is it just pop stars trying to be cool? I don't know, but it's definitely being used, and it definitely, or probably, has some kind of psychological effect on people. When you see a symbol, it kind of resonates with you, possibly at a deep subconscious level. In the book, we talk about the research around innate releasing mechanisms. So these birds who have been raised for generations in captivity, and they've never seen a predator in their life. Their parents and grandparents have never seen a predator. But if you take a cardboard cutout in the shape of a predator and move it above them, they start to panic. So this symbol, this shape, unlocks a hardwired response. And it's probably the same to a certain extent in humans. And that's what people like Carl Jung talk about in terms of archetypes. If you see a certain character or story, you just deeply kind of resonate with it and understand what it is. And I think those kind of symbols are used to manipulate how people feel and think and ultimately behave in pop culture. But as for whether that means there's some grand satanic occult conspiracy, well, there's no evidence for that, as far as I know.
Some would argue there is, but that isn't the debate for today. The point is, at the very least, there is evidence, as you say, that symbolism is the language of the unconscious, subconscious mind. And that's why one of the things I know that in recent years, the 77th Brigade or 77th Battalion, I always get it wrong, brigade or battalion, the UK Army's Division for Psychological Warfare, is PSYOPs for short, do is the use of memes, pictures with words on that get made to go viral through social media, but actually, because the words are with the image, it kind of bypasses, it goes in quicker, it bypasses the critical faculty. That's used a hell of a lot these days, isn't it?
Yeah, so we also have a chapter in the book called Get It in Writing, which is about the effect of imagery, especially video, because as you say, it kind of bypasses the conscious watchdog, as it were. It just goes straight to your emotional brain. Images have what's called pre-attentive effects. So they influence you before you're even consciously aware of what you're looking at. So news stories with images in are better remembered, more persuasive, that kind of thing. And there's also this effect where if you see something visually, you tend to kind of believe it and it sticks with you, even if it's later debunked. And then with memes, there's this kind of meme warfare approach where these images are made super, I guess it's like gain of function, but for an image, you know, they're deliberately made in a way that's going to be made, that they're going to be spread and go as viral as possible. So they use, I don't know, popular culture because we all recognize it and we pay attention to things that are familiar. Or they might use cute animals because we are hardwired to pay attention to cute things for evolutionary reasons. So it's really taking that image element and then ramping it up on steroids by working out what's the most attention-grabbing, engaging stimuli, And also, I guess it's kind of a natural laboratory in that stuff will only get shared if it has that viral potential. So it's kind of a survival of the fittest of memes, as it were.
And on some level, it's got to press an emotional button, hasn't it? The same as with marketing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Content which engages people rationally is generally not as persuasive and effective as things that push an emotional button.
So make people angry, upset, or extreme emotions, I'm guessing, are more likely to cause a viral response.
Yeah, so there's two dimensions roughly that an emotion can be categorized on. There's positive to negative, or negative to positive, I should say, and there's arousal, so how exciting it is, how stimulating it is. Generally speaking, the most stimulating emotions go the most viral. And it doesn't matter too much whether they're negative or positive, though it can depend on the context. But negative emotions, I think, are a bit stronger. I know there's a study or a meta-analysis of studies which found that fear is the emotion which is most likely to activate the emotional part of the brain. So it's the strongest emotion. There's also a study on the New York Times where they found that, well, what they did was they scraped all the text from these articles and they collected data on whether it went viral or not. And they found that the strongest predictor of going viral was anger. So the more angry the article made people feel, the more likely it was to go viral. So yeah, get people upset, push those buttons. That's why Twitter's so popular, right?
Well, I know that in the media, because I years ago I worked in the media along part of my journey, and there was a saying, which is still there, and if it bleeds, it leads, meaning the more horrific or tragic or emotion gut-wrenching the story was, the more front page prominence or airtime it got, because that would rile people's emotions.
Yeah, so we have something called the negativity bias, so we tend to pay more attention to negative information, probably because of evolutionary reasons. And so what we've ended up with is kind of an exploitation of that bias in the same way that junk food exploits our need for sugar and salt, which used to be adaptive, used to be good for an evolutionary perspective. But now there's so much sugar and salt that actually that's being used against us. In the same way, it's good for us to be sensitive to threat and danger, but now that's being kind of hijacked by this 24-hour news cycle, which is just constant negative emotion, which is probably not very good for us. We have a chapter in the book called Choose Your Illusion, which is about the fact that you can pay attention to this kind of negative stuff. If it bleeds, it leads, or you can kind of curate your own information world, as it were, your own reality, and you turn into what you tune into. So although it seems a bit kind of depressing and dreary, actually there's a lot of power in that, empowerment, that you can improve your reality and yourself by choosing what you consume.
Yeah, you're a product of your environment, whether that be through news sources that, frankly, my opinion is most media is complete and utter bollocks. It's either propaganda, no, little more than propaganda, or it's a politicalized weapon. You've only got to look at the likes of Murdoch having backed every winning prime minister in decades to see that something's not quite right. But anyway, that's going off on a tangent slightly. You mentioned the word fear. Now, the word fear, false evidence against reality. I know that Laura, in her book, COVID-19 book, A State of Fear, goes into how fear it was used as a psychological tool and weaponized during the pandemic. Is it something you also cover, obviously more in perhaps a different context, in Free Your Mind? Because obviously if you get people in a state of fear, if their mind's taken up consciously, as it were, concerned, scared or worried or just overly thinking about something, that in itself, fixation, is meaning that other messages, other programs, other suggestions, commands, or brainwashing, call it what you will, are more likely to go directly into the unconscious, subconscious mind. So fear is a great way of putting people into arguably a hypnotic state. Do you go into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book, we do touch on COVID-19 and all of the response to that, but it's like a broader book about propaganda and websites and politicians and all the rest of it as well. But we do touch on it. But yeah, absolutely. So fear, there's a few things. The first is that it kind of, as you say, switches off the watchdogs of the mind, overwhelms people, and allows the messages to seep in. It also means people act more on heuristics, which means they put less kind of careful thought into things and are more likely to fall upon rules of thumb, like the authority bias or the social proof bias. So when we're scared, we're much more likely to follow the crowd and to follow the experts and the leaders, which generally speaking is probably a good thing, but it can also be used against us. Also, fear can generally wear people down over time. Stress, as you probably know, is not very good for you. So it has a kind of bamboozling effect. And as I'm sure you know, if you bamboozle people, it's then much easier to implant kind of suggestions and commands and so on. It's called the disrupt and reframe technique. And interestingly, there's a book called...
Which, just for viewers and listeners who've got any of my training materials, that Patrick just alluded to, I call it, it's the same thing, but I just refer to it as the confusion and disorientation approach. But it's the same thing if you're looking at the stuff. So that's what Patrick just mentioned.
Yeah, there's loads of names that I've seen for it, actually. It's very interesting. There's also the fear then relief technique, which is kind of similar. And even, again, don't want to get too conspiratorial or woo-woo, but I don't know if you know Baphomet, the goat-headed deity.
Yeah.
If you look at illustrations, there's a tattoo, I guess, on his arms that says solve e coagula, which means dissolve and coagulate. So break something down and then build it back up. So it's all the same thing about kind of disrupting people, breaking down their conscious kind of habits and thoughts and patterns and so on, and then you can implant new stuff in what's left.
Which I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it segues wonderfully into kind of going back to the beginning. Because at one point you said, "Oh, talking about things like MK Ultras, perhaps a bit extreme end." However, the stuff that's being used in advertising and marketing or political campaign, just in everyday life generally, to influence, persuade, and control people, has its roots in MK Ultra. That was, viewers and listeners who don't know, was set up by the CIA shortly after the war, when Joseph Mengele was smuggled in with Operation Paperclip into America, and they started doing trauma-based mind control experiments. And a lot of what they learned from that, because they were linked at the same time with the Tavistock Hospital in England, which later morphed into the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, which is sat in the same bloody office on a back street in London as the British Psychological Society, same building as the people who prescribe drugs for profit when there's no proof that the drugs actually bloody work. But they also have their offshoot just outside Westminster, linked to them, the Behavioural Insights team, aka the Nudge Unit. So all of this does, although it sounds extreme to mention MK Ultra, all of it has its roots in MK Ultra mind control experiment findings and Operation Mockingbird with the media that the CIA said ended in the 70s, but you've only got to look at the media to see that they're corrupt as anything, the majority of them. What's your kind of take on that? Because I know that the book's to help protect people, not just to educate, but it's to help stop them from getting, if you like, screwed over by being influenced, controlled, and persuaded without their knowledge and consent.
Yeah, so I went to university at UCL, so I know Tavistock Square quite well. I used to walk past those buildings quite a lot. So yeah, I mean, MK Ultra, one interesting thing about that is if you bring it up, there's still this kind of stigma, I guess, that you might be called a conspiracy theorist or something, when it's it's true. It's admitted. There's published papers that came out of it that you can read on Google Scholar. It's not a conspiracy theory at all. There is definitely as you say, a kind of link from MK Ultra to the type of techniques that are used today. MK Ultra a bit extreme in terms of the fact that they would put people in isolation tanks, for example, and play the same message over and over again, or give people LSD, or there was Operation Midnight Climax where they used prostitutes. I mean, it was all the same kind of thing to break down people's conscious defenses.
Well, you say a bit, but I mean, isolation, one could argue, and I'm sure this is, you either cover it in this book or Laura probably covers it in COVID-19 book, but you could argue that the effects they'd studied on isolation and how it made people more suggestible and influenced kind of came into play in the pandemic by locking people down and regimenting that they could only go out for a certain period of time and all that kind of stuff.
You could argue that, and yeah, one could definitely argue that, but you know, there's no leaked white paper that says this was a deliberate technique. But yeah, I mean, so this is what actually inspired me to read about brainwashing and how a mass of people can be hypnotized and have their behavior completely transformed almost overnight. Was the lockdowns and all of the response, but it pretty much, yeah, is the same playbook, whether that was deliberate or not. But it's extreme stress, isolation, confinement, controlling what information people have, and there's even some stuff about masks, like in Guantanamo Bay, they're made to wear face masks as well. So
makes you feel more submissive.
Yeah, more submissive. Even there's research with dogs where when they're made to wear muzzles, their body language then becomes completely submissive. They lie down, their tail between their legs. But there's no, you can't say for sure that was done deliberately.
Well, no, of course you can. It's just a stunningly quaint coincidence that there are these overlaps, as it were. Now, this book, without a doubt, okay, I've not read it all yet. However, what little I have, I'm telling all of you viewers, and I'm telling you all of you listeners, that I already 100%, 150% unreservedly recommend this book. It's ridiculously good value for money. It's only £17.99, and that's for the hardback book. Okay, paperback's not out yet. That's hardback, and it's 384 pages, but it's not, from what I've seen so far, it is not a padded 384 pages. Other people could have padded this out probably to 800 pages. This is to the point, pure gold for anyone who wants to understand more about how we are all being, from pretty much all areas of our life, influenced, persuaded, nudged, controlled. You could use all manner of terms. Give us a bit of a wider picture to people, the kind of areas of life that are covered in the book, where people may not currently realize that these kind of things are being used on them.
Well, thank you for your very kind description of the book. I'll also add another nudge to that and say it is a Sunday Times bestseller now, so there's a social proof nudge there as well. So yeah, it covers a wide range of things. For example, relationships and pickup artists are covered in the book. That's actually how I came into my interest in psychology about 15 years ago at least.
Okay.
Through things like
The Game and stuff, Neil.
The Game and Ross Jeffries, you may be aware of.
Yeah, I know Ross. Yeah, we've interviewed him. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, so that's, and they're the kind of techniques like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that kind of thing, and how that's used, for example, by governments, but also day to day when you're shopping. So when you go into the
boot camp, my students, at the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, I call it the push me pull you technique. Different names, same thing. You find that a lot in the psychological arena that different people call the same thing different names, but that's what I'm saying. Basically, get the book because you will recognize stuff that you've learned as a hypnotist. Sorry to interrupt, Patrick. Continue.
Yeah. So shopping, for example, how supermarkets exploit your what's called ego depletion. So they put trinkets and snacks by the checkout because by the time you get there, you're stressed and tired and you're more likely to impulse buy. When you hire a car, when you get to the airport to hire a car, you're also tired and hungry probably, and so that's when they bamboozle you into buying that useless extra insurance. So shopping is another example. Obviously pop culture, whether it's TV, music videos, Hollywood movies, that's very much talked about in the book. Yeah, so the whole wide range of any kind of communication that you might come into.
But what top tips now? Obviously the key one is buy the book and then they can learn in depth, but what sort of a few suggestions, people get an idea of things that people can do to kind of inoculate themselves or protect themselves against these things, or at least become more aware that it is happening to them?
Yeah, so as you say, inoculation is one thing that people can do, so they can get immunity from these techniques by being able to spot them. I mean, that only goes so far. These techniques are a bit like an optical illusion. Even if you're aware it's an illusion, you can still be influenced by it. And in the same way, you know, if you were to know that the supply of diamonds was artificially restricted by De Beers to make them scarce and therefore more valuable, you could know that rationally, and you'd still probably love to be given a diamond for free. So you can't kind of unthink your way completely out of this. But you can get a level of immunity, so absolutely buy the book to learn more about the techniques. But there are a few other things you can do. One of which is simply to reduce your exposure to these kind of techniques if you don't want to be influenced by them. So we interviewed a magician and asked him, how do you not get tricked by a magician? And he said, don't go to the show. So in the same way, if you don't if you don't want to get tricked by Hollywood symbolism, for example, you have to kind of stop watching Hollywood movies, or at least cut down your viewing of them. So we have a lot in there about television, social media, even pornography, with the ultimate recommendation being to kind of cut these back a bit, at least, or watch them more mindfully. Don't let them just kind of rap on your skull, as it were. You can also do things to uplift your consciousness, as it were. So thanks to ego depletion, you're more likely to be nudged if you're hungry, tired, and so on. So if you have an important decision to make sure you don't do it when you're hungry or tired. Don't do it at the end of the day. Try not to watch news, at 10 p.m. because that's really when it's going to get into your subconscious and influence you. There are also other principles. We have a chapter which is titled Stand for Something or Fall for Anything, which is the importance of having certain principles to anchor yourself to so you don't get swept away. And that can happen on a grand scale. One book talked about how prisoners of war were less likely to be brainwashed in the Korean War if they were Jehovah's Witnesses, because they had a really strong faith and doctrine to kind of cling to for certainty. But it also happens on a smaller scale. If you go to a casino, you're less likely to overspend if you have a budget in mind. Or if you go shopping, you're less likely to impulse buy if you have a list that you're going to buy in advance. So just having a kind of plan, principles, whatever, stops you from being swept away. So that's just some examples of some tips.
So this is a devil's advocate question, so I apologize in advance, but I try and ask things that I know viewers or listeners will be thinking. You've wrote this book and it's got great reviews already coming in. Indeed, already. Oh, bloody hell. I hit the wrong window there. I'm trying to, there we go. So already, for example, snappily written, made me more aware of the nudges and persuasions that were part of my everyday life. The Mail on Sunday. An important new book. Laura Dodsworth and Patrick Fagan have some great ideas for how to recognise nudge, unique tactics and how to fight back. The Telegraph. An informative and engaging read, Forbes magazine. An essential and entertaining read, a treasure trove of a book, Critical Therapy Antidote. And I could go on and on. That's just a few random ones. It's getting great reviews, deservedly so. And it's been written by two experts, you coming from the psychology, behavioural scientist background, Laura coming from the journalism background, which in itself, media, as we've discussed, is kind of manipulative mind control in certain contexts. How does that balance the fact that you've released this book, which is educating the public and helping inoculate them, when, for example, you are still currently working, or at least your site indicates so, as a chief scientific officer at behavioural science consultancy Capuchin, and you work for companies helping them to come up with plans to influence people through advertising and marketing and whatnot. Isn't that kind of a bit of a conflict of interest?
Kind of. So I kind of see myself a bit like the magician showing how the magic tricks work. And so that gives people a level of immunity and security against it if they want that. But I am still a magician, you know, that's still my job. I think where I draw a distinction and maybe come up with an excuse and rationalization for myself is the difference between brands or websites using these kind of techniques and governments using it. Because with brands, which is what I do, and sometimes political campaigns, but I don't think they really have that much impact on the real world, to be honest. But with brands, there's kind of a transparent selfishness about what they want, and they don't have a kind of moral imperative with their behavior. So there's limits to what they can do, and you can opt out, and it's clear what they want from you. So Coca-Cola, for example, they just want you to buy Coke, and you know that. And if you enter into a relationship with them, it's clear, you know that they're going to do everything that they can to get you to buy Coca-Cola, and maybe your guard is up. And if you don't buy it, then, well, that's it, really. It's not like they want 100% penetration. Well, I'm sure they want 100% penetration of Coca-Cola, but they don't feel it's their moral imperative. It's their duty to have it. They don't have a team dedicated to fighting Coca-Cola hesitancy or anything like that. Whereas with the government, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the fact that they have kind of total power and total moral imperative, that's, I think, what can make it dangerous. Because you can't really escape the nudges, can't really opt out, and they feel like you should comply. And I think that's what the difference is. So the work that I do, you know, I don't think I'm ever going to win a Nobel Prize for it. I wouldn't say it's particularly positively ethical, but it's just advertising, basically, getting people to buy stuff, getting people to sign up on a website, that kind of thing. I don't think it's particularly dangerous or evil.
Yeah, sorry to ask.
No,
I just know that if I didn't, I would get a viewer list going, why don't you ask that? Because it does seem a bit odd. On the one hand, he's telling us how it's done. Now, this goes the next stage of playing devil's advocate. I know from my experience as a stage hypnotist, a hypnotherapist, and also time spent as a magician and mind reader, sort of Derren Brown style, and things I've done behind the scenes using those things, such as getting people to reveal confidential information to me without them consciously knowing that they had done, which I did for the Gadget Show on Channel 5, to prove it could be done, because most hypnotists say you can't make people do things against their moral code or their conscious mind. And that is, in my experience, complete and utter bullshit, spouted by people who either A, don't know what they're doing, because they were taught by someone who fed them that same narrative that you can't get people to do things against the moral code, or B, people who do know that it's possible but are scared that if they told the truth they'd lose therapy clients or whatever. What's your view on that? Because mine, bearing in mind that mine is pure and simple this, it's not a case of getting people to do things against their moral code or their values. it's a case of nudging, influencing, and controlling them to believe that their values are in alignment with doing that you want them to do.
Yeah. So I recently read this classic book called Propaganda by
Edward Bernays.
Oh, yeah, that too as well. But this one's by a French philosopher.
Oh, right, okay. Same title, different person. Oh.
This one. Sorry, there you go.
Oh, okay. I have not read that one. I'll have to order that.
Yeah, it's good. It's very dense, and each page has so much interesting information that you have to take a breather and just think about what he said. But he makes a very good point that propaganda is not really about implanting things in people, but it's about finding what's already within them, their own kind of desires, sometimes repressed desires or fears or anxieties, and then using that as a catalyst, as kind of steam in the engine to drive behavior in the way that you want. And I think that's kind of what you're saying as well. It's about finding out what is within people and then aligning that with what you want them to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's exactly what I was kind of referring to. And I mean, two books I'll mention, because I'd like to ask you on the bigger picture of that, namely the difference between influencing an individual or influencing groups of people. Because in two classic books, I think the one that was published first was Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of the Crowds by Charles Mackay. And then later was published The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, both of which speak about crowd and group psychology. Could you explain a bit about the difference between, it's easier to influence a group if you can steer them all to the same thought than it is perhaps one individual?
So when people are together, and I think Le Bon distinguishes between a group and a crowd. It's been a while since I read it, but a crowd, so a group is a collection of individuals, whereas a crowd is where people become a bit like a shoal of fish or a murmuration of birds. They all move. They all move as one, like a shoal of fish, like a single organism together. And so, but I think it's kind of the same techniques. I mean, there's breaking down conscious resistance. At rallies, you might have drums or loud music or something, or chants, or getting people to walk up and down so they become tired. And then there's kind of a trickle-down effect, I think. So you need to find certain influences within the group, which everyone else follows. And then when there's that less rational conscious thought, that's when people tend to just do what everyone else is doing. But yeah, people kind of, I think Jung talks about the emotional temperature. When the emotional temperature is high enough, people lose themselves. And then that's when, again, it's like this breakdown where it all kind of dissolves into one singular mass that moves in a unified way. But there has to be that emotional temperature that's reached first. And so I suppose that's where you'd have propaganda, which stokes up fears, or if people are in person, someone speaking on a stage, wildly gesticulating and bringing up visions that are fantastical and shocking with their speech. And again, the drums and the music, all of that to kind of bring up the emotional temperature and melt the group into a crowd, as it were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I mean, somewhat slightly controversial example, but it's just anyone, if you go on YouTube and type in, why am I now having a mental brain fart block? Benny Hinn, evangelical preacher, and see him at work and a crowd of thousands of people who then get so hypnotized that they think the power of God is knocking them over without being touched. That kind of visually is a great example of exactly what you've just described.
I think, so I don't know this person in particular, but I would assume that they again, get people really worked up emotionally, talk about hell and heaven and demons and things. And that's when people get overwhelmed, and then they're much more likely to be suggestible to these kind of techniques of pushing people over or speaking in tongues and things like that.
Yeah, precisely, exactly what they do. And crikey, time is 50 minutes already gone. I'm sorry, where does time bloody go? Look, I could talk to you for bloody hours, but the bottom line is I'm going to cut to what is my last question for everybody, which is basically to give you the floor. And either you can either look at it as share your top 3 tips for protecting yourself, or the top 3 observations of how this things that people might not have realized this is going on in the world, or be as blatant, which you can be, because I'm saying go and buy this book. To everyone who listens to this and watches it, don't think about it. Just actually take action. Go and get the book from the link that'll be above or below this video or the audio podcast. Just click on it, get to Amazon, order it. But you can be as blatant as the 3 main reasons why you believe everyone would benefit from getting this book and reading it. The floor is yours, Patrick.
Yeah, I mean, people I know who've read the book so far have said that it's changed them. Has certainly changed the way that they consume and interact with content. My wife, for example, I know this is a biased sample, obviously, but she can't listen to her YouTube videos the same anymore because she notices how they get her worked up about something which she wasn't even thinking about 5 minutes ago and is really inconsequential. But it just, again, raises that emotional temperature in her, which is kind of addictive. And that's why you keep watching the videos and engaging with it. But it has really changed her life in that small sense. It's also, there's a lot of scientific research covered in the book. We also draw on post-war psychologists, psychoanalysts like Jung and Eric Hoffer, Fear of Freedom. I can't remember what that. Anyway, these great books which came out about the psychology of how the mass can be manipulated so much, but also it's an entertaining, kind of engaging read. There's lots of real life examples and stories to bring things to life. And also Laura and I did some kind of investigative gonzo type journalism. So I, for example, joined it's called a masculinity retreat. My wife called it a cult. I think that's a bit.
I was going to say it sounds a bit cultish. That, yeah.
It was a bit cultish, but it was good for me. And so, as I say in that chapter, so we did some of these investigations and wrote them up as little stories peppered throughout the book. So it is a fun read. But as I said in that chapter, isn't it good to give your brain a little wash now and then? I mean, if you get married, for example, that is a brainwashing ritual. It has these certain symbolic elements and so on, but it's a rite of passage that transforms you. And sometimes, you know, those are good for you. But yeah, so there's a story of when I went to this retreat in the woods, and you can read in that story how it used the techniques we're talking about in the book. So, for example, they only fed us nuts and fruit for the weekend. We didn't get much sleep. We were in a kind of a stress position at the start. They had us answer very personal questions. For example, you get paired with a stranger and you'd have to say what you thought of their appearance and just talk for a minute straight about what you thought of their appearance. So all of these techniques designed to kind of overwhelm you. Also, your identity, yourself was stripped away, all your jewelry was taken, your phone, your car keys, your name even, and you were given a number instead of a name. Okay. To break down your identity to make you more malleable. So there's a lot more to it. There was heavy symbolism as well throughout the weekend. For example, we did a sweat lodge at the end where you kind of slither out naked on your belly on the mud through the flaps of the tent. And obviously that's kind of a symbolic rebirth. So yeah, you can read through these personal stories, how the techniques can actually come to life in the real world. So it's engaging, it's scientific, and it's transformative, I think.
Excellent. And my final question, I promise you, and again, this one's devil's advocate, but it's an oxymoron, paradoxical question. I said that up front because there is no right or wrong answer. But there is potentially a problem with books like this, isn't there? I'm saying buy it at the end of the day, right? But there is potentially a problem because you're sharing these things for people to become aware of, and they therefore, assuming they pay attention, can become more aware of these things and therefore inoculate themselves, protect, or at least have more control over how it affects them or not. But while they're focused on being aware of these things going on in life, they're less likely to notice things that they haven't learned about in the book, which I'm not accusing you of purposely held things back, but is that an element of why you're still working for companies in the marketing, or the fact that there are things that you haven't revealed in the book because you're over here making money doing that, and actually by revealing a large amount of techniques here, which does help people and protect them and educate them and entertain them and tons of positives, so definitely go and get the book. But by virtue, ironically, that also makes them more vulnerable to certain techniques, namely the ones that aren't revealed in the book.
Well, there's nothing that we haven't revealed in the book that I use in my work. Well, obviously, I mean, I have a whole toolkit of things that I use for work. I mean, there's probably hundreds of these biases. We can't really talk about them all in the book, but that's not for any kind of Machiavellian reason. It's just because it would be quite a boring and tedious book to go through them all. But it's a very interesting point that you make. And as I'm sure you know, magicians work by keeping your eyes focused on a particular place and using misdirection. And you can only focus a very limited spotlight of attention on any one thing at a time. And so wherever you are looking, that illuminated area, there's this whole other non-illuminated area that you're not looking at. And that's where the trick takes place. So it's not really possible on the whole to not be tricked, because we don't have an all-seeing eye. We don't know all of the information and everything that's happening in the world. You're always going to have blind spots, and that's where the manipulation happens. But number one, if you read this book, I mean, you'll be less blind than you were beforehand, so it should help. And number two, there's kind of a power in that. We have a chapter called Choose Your Illusion, about the fact that you can choose where you're looking at. You can look at a happier, healthier version of reality. You know, if you want the world to be more poetic, you just need to read poetry. But yeah, you can't not have blind spots.
Excellent. Thank you so much for putting up with my slightly, some of them off the wall questions. Thank you for your honest answers. It's been absolutely fantastic. And what can I say other than go to the link above or below this video, or the audio symbol on the podcast channels, and grab your copy of Free Your Mind today. I will. We will finish by me asking you just to tell viewers and listeners a little bit about your other book, which I reckon people should go and get a copy of as well, namely Hooked, Why Cute Sells and Other Marketing Magic We Just Can't Resist, because learning about marketing is something I encourage all my hypnosis students to do, because obviously learning about marketing helps them attract more clients for their business. Hence, I would say it's wise to get a copy of this book. What will they learn within Hooked?
So it's called Hooked. That's a bit blurry, but it has a pug on the front.
Yeah, we saw the pug.
So it's the one with the pug. And I put a pug on the front because, as I mentioned earlier, we are evolutionarily hardwired to pay attention to cute things, because our offspring wouldn't have done so well if we didn't do that. And so that's why adverts have talking meerkats in, for example, because you'll pay attention to that. And so that's really what the book is about. Not just about cute things, that's just one small part of it, but it's about how do you grab people's limited attention spans, whether it's through, yes, cute things, but also surprising things, personal things, emotional things, food and sex and faces, these kinds of things. And then once you have their attention, how do you keep them engaged and get them to actually take on board what you're saying? And you can do that through fluency, so making it as short, as simple as possible and using imagery and visual metaphor. You can do it through curiosity, which is kind of rhetorical questions and puzzles and brain teasers, that kind of thing. And you can do it through stories, which are a very effective way to get people to digest and remember information. And then finally, that information you want them to remember and absorb, how do you frame that in a way that's going to persuade people and change behavior? And then the book applies that to whether it's adverts, emails, letters, PowerPoint presentations, whatever it is, you want to grab attention, engage people and change their behavior.
You must read book by the sounds of it. Ladies and gentlemen, metaphorically, please give a huge round of applause to Patrick for kindly sharing this information with us. And the way you can do that is to like this podcast or this video, wherever it is, comment underneath and share it to help spread the words that other people can learn about Free Your Mind and where to get it from. Thank you so much indeed, Patrick. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Join me again for another edition of Hypnosis Week. Bye for now.